but we'll get there. We'll get there. Okay, 434. Mark, I hope you're on. I hope you're able to get on. If you're not on, give me a holler and we'll try and figure it out. Okay. So what I'd like to do tonight is try to. We've sort of reached the end of a section of Mishpatim. When we have this very last pasuk that we did, where it said "Veger lo silchatz" on page 434, pasuk tes, verse 9. "Veger lo silchatz," don't oppress the ger. "V'atem yidatem es nefesh hager," you know the soul of the ger. "Ki gerim heyisem beretz Mitzrayim," because you were gerim in Eretz Mitzrayim. So at that point, we've sort of reached the end of a section. And we're going to be shifting into something else. You can tell, you see from the left side of the page that the next subject is going to take us into Shemitah and a couple of other, and the Chagim. So why we transition into those things and what we've been doing up until now is something that I'd like to try to focus on. So let me just see if I can, I don't know if Mark is on. Okay. So let me
just one thing,
Yeah.
I told you we're going away on Sunday, so I don't know if you have any classes next week or not.
No class next week. It's Hanukkah, so we'll take a break. Okay. Okay. What I'd like to do tonight is to give a little bit of a structure.
Just Mike.
Okay.
Mike.
434.
You gave me the sign language that came in last week, so.
Okay, 434. Okay, good. You're returning the favor. So what I'd like to do is try to present a little bit of a structure to all of the things that we've been learning so far in Mishpatim. It seems to be a little bit of a.
Would it be easier for you if I sat next to him?
It's fine. Whatever. It's fine.
No,
I'll look all around. It seems to be a mishmash of everything. All right. Seems to be a mishmash of everything, how it's all put together. And what we're going to try to do is give it a little bit of a structure. Albert, how are you? Good to see you. We're going to try to give it a little bit of a structure, and we're going to base it on an observation by Rabbi Menachem Leibtag on his, he has a Tanakh website, and if you ever want to know how a section of the Chumash is structured, you go to his website, right? It's tanakh.org, a fascinating website, and there he explains the structure of Mishpatim. So instead of us looking at it, we have all these, think back to all these various laws. An ox gores a person, an ox gores another ox, an ox causes damages, a person causes damages. What happens with it? We've learned a whole bunch of seemingly unrelated halachos, but in actuality, they are very much related. And what we're going to do is try to gain an understanding tonight of how all of these pieces fit together, okay? We're going to end on our pasuk, right? On this pasuk, page 434, Perek Chav Gimel pasuk tes. We're going to end on verse 9. But we're going to jump back to sort of see how things begin. So I'm going to give you an overall perspective, again, based on what Rabbi Leibtag says, that from the beginning of Chumash Mishpatim until this point, there are three major sections. Three major sections. Like, I don't know, Mark is unable to join us. Okay. Hang on just a second, everybody. FaceTime won't work. Okay. Three major sections in how we can understand and how we can define Mishpatim. So that's what we're going to try to do here. In order to do that, I want you to go back to the beginning of Mishpatim, and I want to lay out the first section for you. So jump back in your Chumash page 416. On page 400. Okay, hold on just a second. That's the beginning of this structure here. Okay, that's the beginning of the structure, 416. And if we go from page 416, we're going to see as follows. Let me break it up with you, okay? So the first 10 psukim on page 416 have to deal with avadim, with the laws of slaves, the laws of Jewish slaves, both male and female. Rabbi Liebtag suggests that this whole first section, right, not just slavery, but this whole first section, which I'm going to lay out for you, has a particular purpose, and the purpose is to create the moral foundation of society. The moral foundation of society is based on having a court system that enforces compliance with the basic laws of human interaction. That's the opening part of Parshas Mishpatim, okay? So it starts with the laws of Avadim, because in those days, Avadim were very much a part of the social fabric of society, and they needed to be treated in a particular way, in a way of sensitivity and compassion, and that's what this beginning part talks about. That's the first 10 psukim. That goes from page 416 to page 418, and literally through 420 at the top of the page, up to V'yotza Chinam Ein Kasef. It's the laws of an Eved Ivri, of a Jewish male servant who doesn't want to leave his master, and remember piercing his ear, and then the laws of a Jewish maidservant who is sold at a young age, essentially married off at a young age. So from the beginning of Mishpatim to here deals with this slavery, which was a part of the social fabric. From the top of page 420, right, which is beginning with verse 12 until verse 16, right, from verse 12 here until the next chapter, verse 16. So we're talking about from page 420 all the way through page 428. All of these laws in these pages are laws that are best referred to, in the words of Rabbi Liebtag, as case law. These are basic laws of human interaction that are enforced by a court system. You can't have a society without a court system. It doesn't work. And not only are Jews obligated to have a court system, but non-Jews, one of the 7 Noahide commandments is to have a court system and to be able to judge people who violate the norms of society. That's an integral part of society. Now, I'm just going to run through some of the laws and see if, I'm sure you remember them, but just to see if you can find a pattern in what we're talking about, okay? All of these laws are laws that are enforceable by Beis Din.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
And you don't have to answer because it may not be appropriate. So many of the laws we see about slavery, stoning people, and other various things, we've obviously transitioned away from those over time. How did we do that? I find it amazing that we actually endorsed having slaves at some point in time, endorsed doing a number of things that are written. And so how did we transition away from these codes of society, which would no longer be acceptable today?
As society changed, right, as the norms of society changed, the structure of having a court system continued to be in effect. Just the norms of societal behavior changed. Now, if those norms violate Torah law, then we don't follow them. But if they are norms that don't violate Torah law, then we obviously can follow them. So, for instance, you're absolutely right. Nobody has slaves today, right? The whole concept of slavery, the way it was described in the Torah, doesn't exist today. That's fine. Society changes. We don't have slaves anymore. So the laws, these laws of slavery that are recorded here in the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim to address the fabric of society that existed then are no longer applicable to
But
us.
if somebody chose to enslave somebody and cites history as an example.
It's illegal today. In other words, we are bound by the laws of the country in which we live, as long as those laws don't violate Torah. So there's no law in Torah that says you must have a slave. The Torah tells us if you have slaves, this is how you are to treat them. But there's no law that says you must have a slave. Okay? As a result of that, since there is no law that says you must have a slave, if slavery is illegal, which it currently is, so then we are bound by that illegality, and we are not allowed to have slaves. Okay? A similar idea, and that is the Torah permits us to have more than one wife. However, in the society in which we live, it is illegal to have more than one wife. So we are bound to observe that law from the society in which we live. So that's just another example. But let me go through some of these fundamentals, okay? Within this big first section, it starts with the laws of slavery. Then we have the following. We learn the laws of killing a person, of kidnapping someone, and of cursing parents. We also learn the laws of injuring a person, injuring a slave, causing a woman to abort her fetus. If your ox kills someone, if your ox injures someone, if your ox damages someone's property, stealing, the laws of shomrim, and the laws of seduction and rape. Okay, these are all the laws in this first section. So it's seemingly, what's the connection between all of these laws? So according to Rabbi Liebtag, all of these laws are normal laws in the fabric of society, not specifically related to a Jewish society. These are laws bein adam lachavero, between people. And laws between people form the fabric of society. All of them are enforceable by Beis Din, and they're really divided up into two groups. They're divided up into the first group, which is punishable by death. That's if you kill someone, or if you kidnap someone and sell them, or if you curse your parents. The punishment which is recorded in the Torah for those three is death by Beis Din. Right? Beis Din executes you. The rest of them, all of the other laws that we learned, were all laws of compensation. So for instance, if I injure someone, if I injure my slave, if I cause a woman to abort, if my ox gores someone, if it kills someone, if it injures someone, if it damages property, if I steal something, in all of these laws, even down to the case of seduction and rape, in all of these laws, the penalty is compensation. Compensation, right? And who enforces the compensation? Beis Din, right?
And I apologize. I'm having a hard time understanding, even if the society in which Jews lived allowed slavery, I find it difficult, you know what I'm going to say next, I mean, that even though the society in which lived allowed slavery, how in essence they condoned it by creating laws that structure the manner in which you're supposed to treat your slave, as opposed to saying, thou shalt not.
That's correct. There is no law on the books that thou shalt not have a slave.
And that's, I find that
There are
challenging.
well, I mean, this goes back to, it's going to take us off topic because
I know.
it goes back to the very beginning when we started to learn this, the discussion about slavery. There are very limited circumstances in which a person can become a slave. In other words, you can't, in Judaism, you don't go down to the slave market and buy a slave and bring him back to your house and oppress him. That's not what's allowed. There are certain situations in which a Jewish person is actually better off being a slave to another Jewish person than being on his own. If he's impoverished and he can't feed his family, so being a slave is essentially being a hired worker, except you can't, you don't go home at night, but essentially being a hired. So there are, suffice it to say that there are explanations for it, but I'm trying to paint the structure with the big brush. The first part of this structure is, how does the Torah envision the functioning of a Jewish society, which is a subset of how does the Torah envision a functioning of society. Remember, this is coming right after the Ten Commandments. We've gotten the Ten Commandments. The Jewish people are now being primed to live as a people. These are the laws of society. The laws of society start out bein adam lechavero, between people, with the punishment for failure to follow the law administered by a beit din. And that's how society functions. I mean, it goes back to Hobbes, to the political philosopher Hobbes, who essentially said that if it weren't for a fear of punishment, we would kill each other. We'd swallow each other alive. In other words, the idea is that we need to live in a society where we know that we will be held accountable if we harm someone, if we kill someone, if we steal something, and if our property damages someone else's property, that we will be held accountable. We cannot do these things and just walk around, right? There is an accountability for all of these things, and Beis Din is the instrument charged with maintaining this fabric of the society. That's the opening part. That's the opening part. Mike?
Might also help to know that there's a balancing network of considerations. So, for example, the concept behind slavery, not slavery, but a proper term would be more a bond servant,
Indentured.
for a period of time. Yeah. So, Judaism at that time did not practice rampant incarceration. Somebody does something wrong to society, they worked off their obligation. And that's far better than throwing people in jail for 20 years.
No, I was thinking about that, just exactly that. I was just saying, the term slavery is probably not the best.
It's
As opposed
slavery
to
as the Torah
servitude.
defines it. It's
Sure.
servitude. All right, servitude, right?
Yeah, but a very tolerant and beneficent form of indentured servitude is far better than throwing somebody in jail and having them waste away.
Sure, absolutely.
And he's able to form relationships. He's able to correct his demeanor by watching the people, the family that he's working for, and he has to be treated very benevolently. We all learned that in the first number of lessons. So it's not to identify it with what happened here in the South.
And so many other places in the world,
Yeah, it's just not the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be better if they
Good.
had a different
I would,
name.
you would say that somewhere that as a Jews, we don't kill the Jews, even if they kill someone.
Who said that?
A couple of months ago, something like that.
No. Well,
That's-
I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically. Today, we don't have capital punishment. That we as a Jewish society, as a halachic society, we can't enforce capital punishment. Our Beit Din has no ability to punish in any way. Forget capital punishment. We can't even punish monetarily.
Right.
Right? We don't have any, the Beit Din system doesn't have any teeth. The best we can do is send you into court, into secular court to go and collect. But the Beit Din doesn't have any teeth. But even in a society where we were governed by Beit Din, at a particular point, we stopped executing people. The Beit Din stopped carrying out capital punishment.
And when was that?
Before the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. So maybe I'm thinking around the turn of the century.
And the other thing is why for rape is not any punishment as a jail time or anything like that. Only I have problem with that. Why is just accordingly going to the monetary.
So we mentioned,
payment.
so when we learned it, we mentioned the concept of compensation, and not only compensation, but that this man is now obligated to take care of this woman for the rest of her life at her choosing. In other words, she is not obligated to him,
Right.
but he is obligated to her.
If she wants.
Right? So what has happened is he has, in effect, he has diminished her value.
Right.
Right? He's diminished her value in society.
He has to pay.
So he now has to make sure that she is taken care of. And he can never stop that. That obligation never stops unless she stops it. Right? So it's a different, remember, we don't really have a concept of jail. So we don't really throw people in jail. Jail is not a constructive punishment within our Beit Din system.
The puzzle only I have is that most of the country in the world, they're taking most of the laws from Torah, according to what I might say. When it comes to this part, which is the rape, it is not even close. It's, most of the country, they say, you are in jail, or
Right, because that
not financial.
right. So what's happened is that society, even though let's say there's a Judeo-Christian basis for the laws of society, society has gone beyond that and clearly introduced this concept of incarceration. Incarceration was never a Jewish concept. Whether it was a non-Jewish concept, I don't know, but it was never a Jewish concept. And today, I think that there's, frankly, discussion about how successful incarceration is. It
Yeah,
might be
the last
very
week on
successful, but it might be very successful at creating career criminals. I don't know how successful incarceration is at rehabilitation. I don't know.
The associate path would protect society.
No, so Einach Hinami, it's true that there is a value to it and that it protects society. That's true. Okay, so if we start with these broad strokes, the first category in Mishpatim is basic societal structure. A Beit Din that enforces the basic obligations bein Adam lechavero, between people. The next part of Mishpatim, which starts with verse 21, chapter 22, verse 21, which is on page 430. This is the second broad section of Parshas Mishpatim, and it talks about some interesting concepts. First of all, it talks about not mistreating the widow and the orphan. It talks about taking collateral from someone to whom you loan money and how you deal with that collateral in order not to oppress the person to whom you've lent the money. It talks about not cursing the leaders of the people. It talks about taking care of your financial obligations, your ma'aser and your trumos, paying off your trumos and maasers. And it talks about the basic laws of the basic dietary laws. So what are these? What's the idea of this second section? So these are laws bein Adam lechavero at the beginning that are not at all given over to the realm of Beis Din. So for instance, to treat the widow and the orphan properly, to not oppress the widow and the orphan, who's in charge of making sure that we don't do that? The Ribono Shel Olam, God is. We've transitioned in this section from the basic moral structure of society, which Beis Din enforces, to a more elevated ethics that God himself enforces. So for instance, if we, the Torah tells us, if we mistreat the orphan or the widow, they are going to cry out to God and says, God, I am going to hear their cry. If we mistreat the borrower by not returning the collateral to him when he needs it, so he is going to cry out to God, and God is going to hear that cry, and we are going to be punished. What the second section is telling us is that in addition to a basic structure of societal interaction that Beis Din enforces, there is an ethic above that, ethical behavior above that, that God himself enforces in the Jewish community, that we are to aim for, to strive for. God himself enforces that. This section is introduced by, if you look on page 430, if you look in verse 20, it's introduced by the verse that says, "V'ger lo soneh." You shouldn't mistreat a ger, a convert. "V'lo sil chatzenu," and you shouldn't oppress him. "Ki gerim heyisem be'eretz Mitzrayim," because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That's the beginning of this section. Last week we learned the end of the section, which interestingly concludes with the same thing, that you have to be compassionate towards a convert because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. So we have this idea that manifests itself of this higher ethic. Okay, so broad brushstroke number one, the idea that we have a society that needs a Beis Din in order to function, basic human interaction. Broad brushstroke number two is that there is also an expectation of ethical behavior on the part of the Jewish society. And that ethical behavior is not to be enforced by Beis Din. Beis Din is really not in a position to enforce that. That ethical behavior is to be enforced by God himself. And finally, the third broad brushstroke, the top, if you will, of the wedding cake, right? We have three layers. That bottom layer, the middle layer of the higher ethics, and now the third layer. And what's that third layer? So that third layer brings us to an ethic that is above, or I should say beyond punishment. In other words, that a judge needs to act with honesty and integrity. That if we see our enemy's animal that's lost or under a burden, we're obligated to help out. That a judge is not allowed to take bribes in any form. These laws which are here are laws that develop a higher ethic within us that are not punishable. So for instance, if a judge takes a bribe, there's no punishment. There's no punishment.
So then why he shouldn't take it? You would think, why shouldn't I take it?
Because the Torah tells him not to take it.
Why is there no punishment?
There is because what the structure of Mishpatim is to build to a point where we are able to integrate into our own behavior ethical practices for the sake of their goodness and not because we're going to be punished for them.
But we're human. and human beings in general don't behave that way.
That's why we have a progression here. In other words, the Torah understood we're human beings, so human beings, we're going to injure somebody, we're going to kill somebody maybe, our property is going to damage someone, whatever, and we need to regulate those. And in addition to the regulations, we need to be able to enforce them. Then we talk about a higher ethics. It's almost impossible for a Beis Din to enforce a higher ethics. Right? Don't mistreat the widow. Don't mistreat the orphan.
But in terms of being in a position to render judgment to certain plaintiffs, and if you take a bribe or do this or do that, that affects your ability to judge
Oh,
ethically.
no, that's correct. In other words, a judge who takes a bribe
I mean, the assumption
might
is
not
that-
be allowed to serve anymore as a judge.
Yeah, but the assumption is that people who've reached that level are indeed not like your fellow human beings, I don't know, just how many.
Well, that's what we're building towards.
If the bribe is not found out, he has to deal with upstairs, just like everybody else.
No,
If it is found out, he's not gonna be a happy camper in the society in which he finds himself, because everybody's gonna, know that the guy's a bribe taker, and
but there are consequences,
he'll be a very unhappy guy in his society, in his neighborhood, in his community. He'll lose his honorifics.
it is a
So he
consequence.
moved to another community, what's the big deal? He keep getting the bribe, there's so many judges, not in the Jewish, not in CRC, whatever, I don't know about it. In many other places, they taking bribes left and right, in Brooklyn, in family
New York
court.
City, trap guy. You
Day
gave
and
me my
night.
own example, just,
And,
Yeah, but
and
we're
there is
dealing with-
punishment
we're
for
dealing with
it,
the ideal.
punishment for it, and still they doing it.
No, the Torah is giving us. Remember, we are being given here a blueprint for how to build society. So the idea is that when we have these other structures in place, when we have a basic fabric built on regulation of human interaction and accountability to a court system, when we have a higher level of ethical behavior that we know we're going to be held accountable by God. So then we come to this highest level, which is the ethical behavior that we're obligated to follow, but not because we're going to be punished. In other words, don't take the bribe because you're going to be punished.
not negative reinforcement.
Don't take the bribe because it's not the right thing to do.
Yeah, possibly.
Right? So that's where we hope to go. In a way, it's like you have children, and children come home from school, and when children are young coming home from school, and it comes time for them to do their homework, so you have to force them to do their homework. They need to be held accountable, right? You have to force them. You hope to get to the point somewhere in this child's life, when he realizes that if he doesn't do this work that he's required to do, it's going to impact on him negatively, and he does it because he understands the role that plays for him. So, Albert, I understand that, the court system might not function on the ideal that we hope it will function on. Although I did hear today that there is a Hasidic woman who is the first Hasidic
Yes.
woman judge, who was elected to a position in Brooklyn, I believe. Right, the first Hasidic woman judge. So who knows? Maybe things are slowly changing. I don't know.
No, I'm just saying it become bias and prejudice. If you enforcing law, you enforce it on everyone. If there is a cop and he's drunk and he kills someone, they enforce law, not because he has a badge or he's gonna get work for free. He's a judge, he's a human being. If you're gonna enforce it, it should be enforcement all over.
Well, that's clear. There's no question that that's part of what our Torah is all about. Because you're not allowed to play favorites. You're not allowed to let the rich guy off or to hold the poor guy more accountable. You're not allowed to do that. There is one justice system for everyone. For everyone. What we're talking about in this last piece is the the highest goal, which is a society that operates on ethics, not because they're going to get caught, not because they're going to be punished, but because they have incorporated ethical behavior into their very essence. And that's why they're operating that way. Are we there? I don't think so. Right? I don't think that we've reached that level yet. Right? But that's the goal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for us. Right? Kadosh Baruch Hu lays out in Mishpatim the way in which we need to approach building a society, with the goal that we'll get to that point hopefully down the road where these ethics will become incorporated within us.
This isn't really a practical, this is a metaphor for where we would like to be at some point. I have a hard time understanding
Well,
that
that's-
somebody in the Beit Din would not be held accountable for their behavior by society if they were found to be engaging in unethical, behavior.
No, I think that they would be held accountable, as Mike explained. If somebody gets a reputation for, they would be held accountable. There are societal norms that serve as methods of accountability. But we're aiming for a society where, I'm an ethical person because that's what I'm supposed to be. Not because if I'm not ethical, I'm going to get punished. Right? I'm ethical because that's what God wants me to be. And I do it not because I'm fearful of being punished. I do it because it's the right thing to do. Okay, that's the goal, Mike.
From a structural standpoint, wouldn't it have made a little bit more sense to put Section 3 as Section 2, since it deals with the Dayanim that are involved in Section 1? I don't know whether Rabbi Liebtag comments on that at all. It seems like dividing up things that relate to the court system, and then with things that relate to laity, and then finally again to the court system, court judge.
Right. I don't think he doesn't speak about that. And my sense is that that's not the way he's not dividing it up, court system, laity, court system. He's dividing it up as basic ben adam lechavero, enforced by the court system. Then a higher level of ethics, also ben adam lechavero, but enforced by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And finally, the highest level of ethics, right, which hopefully doesn't need enforcement and accountability, because by now it's built into the structure, built into us. That's how Rabbi Liebtag literally puts together each of these pieces of Chumash Mishpatim, or of Parshas Mishpatim. And what's interesting is Rabbi Liebtag, when he analyzes the structure of a parsha, he looks for key phrases within the parsha. So, for instance, if you look and you see that on page 430, right, verse 20, which talks about oppressing the ger, seems to be nearly identical to the verse that we concluded with last week on page 434, verse pasuk number 9. Right? They seem to be nearly identical. What is the idea that they are nearly identical? Why would the Torah give us, nearly identical, identically worded psukim? It doesn't seem to be necessary. So Rabbi Liebtag understands it from the perspective of these are the bookends of the ethical structure on both sides. That it starts with the first obligation. Thank you very much, Albert. It starts with the first obligation of how to treat the ger, and it talks about ethical behavior, and the whole ethical behavior section concludes with that one more time how to treat the ger. Now, last week we I hope that I hope that you see the structure the way he laid it out. If you don't see it, it's not his fault, it's my fault. So you can go to tanakh.org and you can, review it there on your own in much greater detail, and I'm sure it will make absolutely good sense to you there. But I want to just focus back on this concept of ki gerim heyisem be'eretz Mitzrayim, that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. So we struggled last week to try to understand that. In other words, we have to treat the convert with compassion, or the stranger with compassion, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. What does us being strangers in the land of Egypt have to do with that? One could even suggest that from a psychological perspective, people who are persecuted and then rise to power themselves turn into persecutors, right? The oppressed sometimes turns into the oppressor.
Power corrupts.
Absolutely. Okay. The oppressed can turn into the oppressor. But what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying here is treat them compassionately because you were oppressed. So what does it mean, right? So what is HaKadosh Baruch Hu telling us? Treat them compassionately because you were oppressed. So it could be, one explanation that we didn't mention last week is it could be that we think that an individual who is a ger, who is a stranger, who is a convert, who doesn't have a support system, doesn't have a family, right, isn't connected into the community, that we can oppress that person and get away with it. Because who's going to stick up for them? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu reminds us that just like he stuck up for us in Egypt, when we were oppressed, we were strangers and we were oppressed, and the Egyptians said, who's going to stick up for them? Ultimately, it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu stuck up for us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us, who took our side, who brought us out of Egypt, who afflicted the Egyptians with the plagues. So the idea that we were strangers and oppressed and God stood up for us should serve to come back and remind us that don't ever think that this person who is a stranger, who is uncomfortable, who maybe isn't connected, who doesn't have a family support system, don't think that this person has no one on his or her side. Why? Because just like you had someone on your side, me, says God, so too I will be on that person's side. And I will help that person, and I will protect that person, and I will ensure that that person is not persecuted and oppressed. So that's lest we think we can get away with it, we are reminded here that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always with the person who doesn't have anybody else there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always there. So that's the idea, that we begin and we end with this concept of being compassionate towards the ger, because we were gerim and because we understood what it means. Not we understood what it meant to be gerim, and therefore we're going to be, we're going to say, gee, I remember how terrible that was, and you must be feeling terrible, so I'm going to be sure that, not to treat you terribly. We mentioned that as an possible interpretation last week, but here it's something different. Here it's actually a little bit more forceful. It's like, don't think you can get away with it. It might be human tendency to try to treat someone who you consider to be inferior in some societal way by oppressing that person because there's nobody to help that person. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, you were in that situation once, and I was there to help you, and I will be there to help the ger. I will hear his cry, I will hear her cry, and I will be there and I will help. So that's this concept of, yes, we're supposed to have within us a sensitivity because we experienced it. That is supposed to make us more sensitive. But it's also possible to interpret this that maybe we won't have that. That maybe we won't have that special sensitivity because we experienced it. And Kadosh Baruch Hu is telling us something else. And that is, even if you don't have that sensitivity, know that I'm not going to let you get away with it. Richard?
Just you know, they always say experience is the best teacher. You know, my wife is not just a convert, but she's converted multiple times. The last baked in, I asked them if they would be willing to submit an application to the Guinness Book of World Records for us. And they got a kick out of it. But I will tell you, we belong to a number of synagogues, and she was definitely not treated the way she ought to have been treated on a reasonable number of occasions, and which kind of forced her to befriend another convert in the synagogue because she was experiencing the same thing, and et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, so why is it that we study the Torah, we read the Torah, we do this, that, generation after generation? What is it that we're not getting that reinforces this negative kind of behavior?
Look, the Gemara in Bava Metzia says, I think there are 36 mitzvos that relate to the way in which we're supposed to treat the convert. We don't have 36 mitzvos that relate to anything else in the Torah. 36 mitzvos that relate to the way in which we are supposed to treat the convert.
2 times high.
Right? So, I mean, you could make the argument that there are so many because HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew how difficult it would be for us to respect them, to observe those laws. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu kept, hitting us over the head time and time again. Everywhere you look, right? Treat the convert a particular way, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu understood human nature, and in human nature, if someone is different than you, unfortunately, there's a tendency to treat that person differently than you might treat someone who's more similar to you. So perhaps the Torah zeroed in on that component. Okay? Now, the ideal, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe this pasuk is sort of like a backdoor slap at the violator who doesn't empathize. So, for example, you're going to be acting like an Egyptian, like a Mitzri.
If you oppress some,
Yeah, in other words, we're looking at it frontally as saying, well, you have to have the requisite empathy because we were Gavin. But maybe it's really saying if you don't have the requisite empathy, you're not much different than an Egyptian oppressor. And
I think
that
that's
was, they were
very
low,
fair
they were
interpretation.
lowlifes as far as
Right.
we were concerned.
Correct.
ethically
Correct.
speaking, so.
Very, very fair interpretation. Now, what's going to happen now in Chumash? It's very interesting. What we are doing is we've sort of gotten these building blocks of how to create society, and as the Jewish society is able to actualize this, to go through that first stage, to go through the second stage, to hopefully reach the third stage, so we will then have created a society that has a special relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when we create a society that has a special relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, special relationships are two-way streets. Meaning that we will have a special relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will in turn have a special relationship with us. And where does that lead us? What's the very next section? The very next section is the laws of Shemitah, of God's special relationship with us, that even if we allow the land to lie fallow, God will ensure that we don't go hungry. That's a miraculous special relationship with us. And it comes about because in this progression of Parshas Mishpatim, we have risen to this level, this third level of acting ethically, because not that we're going to be punished, but because we recognize it as a value. And that's because God commanded us, that special relationship. And in turn, we're going to see several special relationships that are here that are manifestations of God's payback, if you will, to us for having achieved that special relationship with Him. So that's what we're going to focus on when we come back after Hanukkah. Next week, we'll take a break for Hanukkah. When we come back after Hanukkah, we'll focus on that. Mike?
I also see a kind of a nuanced transition into this new subject, because pasuk ends with Kigerim Hayisem Be'eretz Mitzrayim, right? And then we go into the laws of Shmita
Eretz.
Es Artzecha.
Of
So in other
Eretz.
words, what did we get out of Mitzrayim for? To go to the Promised Land. So it transitions right into the obligations in the Promised Land.
Right.
And you have the word Eretz in the former pasuk and Eretz here.
Right, so I think that that's an interesting connection between the two. You know, and we see this transition. One other idea I want to share with you, and that is that it's also possible to look at this entire section of Mishpatim from the beginning of the Parsha until here as actually subcategories of the Ten Commandments. Right? In Parshas Yisro, we got the Ten Commandments. And now one can look at this and almost see within it subcategories of the Ten Commandments. In other words, the very beginning issues that related to belief in God, to not having any other gods, to not believing in any other gods, to not bearing false witness, to honoring a concept of Shabbos, and finally to mitzvos bein adam lechavero. So it's possible to build the structure that actually all of these fit back into the Aseres Hadibros. And that's another general way of understanding Parshas Mishpatim. I'll try to be a little bit more specific for you with it so that you can see what I'm talking about, hopefully. So for instance, if you look at, let's go back to the beginning, to Perek Chaf, right? So if you go back actually a little bit, you go back even a little bit further to the end of Parshas Yisro, so you see, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Ko Samar al Bnei Yisrael, Atem Re'isem ki min hashamayim dibarti imachem. That you see that I spoke to you, you understand, you recognize, you experience this revelation, my revelation to you, so you know there's a God. That's connected to Anochi, all right? And then we see, some of these other laws, the prohibition of idolatry, which is at the very end of Parshas Yisro, right? Prohibition of idolatry, that's the second commandment. Then we come to talk about the obligations of a mizbeach, of how you build a mizbeach. That's at the very end, the very last thing in Parshas Yisro, how you build a mizbeach, and that talks. The mizbeach was used to sanctify HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name, right? To bear true witness to who HaKadosh Baruch Hu was, and not false witness. The Eved Ivri, the whole concept of an Eved. How long does an Eved work for you? 6 years. What happens on the 7th year? He goes free. So this concept of Shabbos is hinted to in the Eved Ivri section. And then all those other laws of capital punishment, of killing someone, of injuring someone, of injuring property, of your property injuring property, of how we have to interact with each other, essentially laws 5, 6, the Dibros, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, are all bein adam lechavero. So it's possible to subsume the majority of what we've done under the construct of the Ten Commandments, and these are essentially spin-offs, if you will, what we could probably refer to as tolados of the Ten Commandments. Okay, we'll stop here for tonight. Thank you for coming, and we will pick up in 2 weeks. Next week, enjoy Hanukkah. We'll pick up in 2 weeks.